senior economist at the National Energy Technology Lab, which is part of the Department of Energy's Office of Fossil Energy. And I welcome you to the morning plenary, dual plenary, entitled The Changing Balance of Government Energy Policy and Regulation. The focus of this plenary is to examine how markets are reacting to the changing federal philosophy on regulation and use of land. We have changing policy, perhaps, with respect to electric generating units and market structure,
So I don't know
from gas
if you pop up to
generation,
the office, I'm sure
renewable generation, and how gas and electric infrastructures are interdependent and how they may be regulated to ensure reliability and resilience. We have differing interests of the states. There's been a lot of discussion at this conference about how states with different resource endowments have different policy agendas, how state-level climate policies might impact the functioning of markets. I had a panel yesterday in which PJM and ISO talked at length about how markets have a hard time adjusting to out-of-market activity by the states. We had a gas generator CEO complain about how markets may not adequately compensate units for the recoupment of capital that they invested under a certain set of market rules. The Trump administration has articulated an America First energy plan that focuses on energy dominance, and one aspect of that is the promotion of energy exports, particularly of oil and gas, but also of coal. That will have an impact as you go upstream to federal lands policy, both onshore and, as I learned yesterday, offshore, also known as submerged lands. The leasing policies, the royalty policies of the Department of the Interior are at issue, and how they manage federal lands and promotion of reasonable land use may be changing from the direction of the past decade. And what's the federal attitude towards vehicle efficiency regulation? CAFE standards may have been suspended. Is that a good thing? We're energy economists, many of us. We tend to believe in incentives rather than command and control. How is that attitude being reflected in the current administration? And then at the end of the day, will all these changes promote economic growth or not, given the trade policy of the United States? So today we have a varied panel and a high-powered one. We have Travis Fisher from FERC, much in the discussion over the last few days. We have Chief Economist from the American Petroleum Institute, Dean Foreman, and we have Assistant Secretary for Land and Minerals Management, Joseph Balash. And since everybody wants to know, I'm Balash, he's Balash, so we say Mr. Balash, Mr. Balash, and we'll get there. We're all descendants of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. But we'll get started with Travis. Travis is Senior Advisor at FERC. He started at FERC well over a decade ago with several degrees from North Carolina State. Spent 7 years there, went to the private sector for half a decade or so, and then came back to politics in the transition and landing teams for the Trump administration. Spent some time at DOE, and is now the Senior Advisor to the Chairman McIntyre of the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. And Travis, you're up.
I'm going to start my own timer so you don't have to be the time police on me. Well, thank you, and thank the whole crowd for being brave early in the morning. I was instructed to keep everybody awake, so I'm going to do my best. And yeah, I guess the only tweak to the introduction. I'm transitioning from the chairman's staff to the Office of Energy Policy and Innovation, and that's effective as soon as my boss sends the email, probably today. So yeah, I want to talk about FERC's angle on the federal-state jurisdictional split and how that affects energy policy. And I'll try to do it in 15 minutes. We'll see how it goes. Standard. I don't speak for either the chairman or FERC itself. So you can't blame FERC for anything I say today, basically. Here's the agenda. I'm going to try to cover a lot of ground. This is, I see some FERC colleagues in the room, so I don't need to explain to everyone what FERC is, but I'm going to start there and we'll move through all these issues. So, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, FERC, or some folks still say FERC. You can call it whatever you want. That's what we're talking about. Independent and resource neutral, and that's the theme that's going to keep coming up as we talk about state policies. We oversee, as long as it's interstate transmission, we probably have some hand in it. So that's on the electricity side and gas and oil. The other important piece is LNG terminals come through us, interstate gas pipelines, and we also have some hydropower projects. Now, all of that affects state policy, and that there's a nexus between everything that FERC does and state policy. My background's electricity, that's where I'm going to focus today. So we talk about the Federal Power Act, if you're looking at the power grid side of what FERC does. Federal Power Act's a 1935 statute. It still drives the bulk of what we do at FERC. You see where it's like just and reasonable, not unduly discriminatory. That's all baked into the 35 statute, but it's still, FERC is a creature of statute, so we still very much stick to those. Ex parte rule, I'm no expert in Latin, but if anyone is a party to a proceeding, you basically can't make your case to me here and now, you have to make it in the docket. So if we creep into that in the Q&A, I'll just say, sorry, there's an ex parte violation there, you have to put it in the docket. So it's no offense to anyone if that happens. It's also, believe me, I would love to be able to engage on all these issues. All the fun stuff is in the docket, so just upfront, ex parte rule. We talked about this split between federal and state jurisdiction. It's baked into the structure. This is where we're playing the hand that Congress has dealt us. FERC and the Federal Power Act, the way it's been structured so far is there's going to be an conflict, especially on the power grid side. Now, I have to note we do respect states' rights. There's arguably a clearer line now after Hughes v. Talon, which is 2 years ago, which was basically as long as you're untethered to the wholesale markets, states can do whatever they want within their own jurisdiction. So if it's within state borders, very close to some free reign as long as you're not tethered to the wholesale markets. And some evidence of that, this was a brief, let's see, it was decided earlier this month. It was decided on the 13th. The brief was earlier in the year, the Illinois ZEC program. FERC actually worked with DOJ to come up with sort of the pro-Illinois side of the brief. So that's just proof that we do respect states' rights. And obviously, we'll defer to states in terms of driving policy. States are in the driver's seat on a lot of these resource decision type policies. And the expectation, this is not news to anyone, this shouldn't be surprising, the expectation is we're going to continue to face this. We had a technical conference in May of 2017, and even at that point it had already been an issue that was brewing, so it wasn't news then, and a year and a half later it's not news now, but we'll continue to deal with this. This is a structural thing that, it's kind of a case-by-case issue of, what state policy we're dealing with, and sort of the frontier of that now, I would argue, is the PJM case, which we can't talk about. But yeah, we'll keep seeing this in terms of state action within wholesale electricity markets. And this is just a map of what exactly we're talking about. A lot of the state action, especially as it impacts capacity markets, that's going to impact the RTOs in the east. You see there, PJM, NYSO, ISO New England. The fun part about this, there is a state level experiment, sort of as far as the state by state experiments of federalism. The laboratory here is ERCOT is not FERC jurisdictional, so they can do whatever they want without FERC's okay. So in terms of FERC policy driving things, ERCOT's kind of an experiment in what happens when you don't have FERC oversight. And if you talk to folks in Texas, they are very happy with that arrangement. And I will add, no one at FERC is talking about making ERCOT FERC jurisdictional, so we are both very happy with the arrangement. Now, when it comes to state policies and wholesale electricity markets, again, this is a very well-known thing, state actions affecting wholesale electricity markets. I think the thing that's happening more and more, you see on the next slide, so we've shifted from more of an RPS type thing where, even though they ratchet up the immediate impact in wholesale electricity markets, especially on the capacity side, isn't quite as stark as when you start using ZECs or nuke plans to keep those plants online. It's just a much larger facility, much higher capacity. But the fundamental question in each case is how do you balance the roles? The conflict, and again, there's no avoiding this. It's just a thing that we have to deal with case by case. The FERC and the wholesale markets that we oversee, they're going to be resource neutral. There's going to be technology agnostic. So when state policies come through that are resource specific, technology specific, you have mandates that say we want this much of this technology. That is a very different world than what FERC does in terms of setting just and reasonable rates and trying to establish, level playing field and sort of a resource neutral market. States are doing the exact opposite. And legally, we're both right, and that's the problem. But we're going to keep examining this interaction. We have a whole bunch of ex parte stuff in front of us. It's not going away, and that's as far as what drives the resource mix. We've seen a lot of state action that is a very strong driver. Obviously, if you have a mandate, that's going to be sort of the strongest driver. But we've also seen the resource mix. It can move on a market basis too. We've seen very low price natural gas, and that has fundamentally changed everything, even in the market setting. So even though we're resource neutral, some resources do end up doing better than others. Some examples of state action, these tend to focus on the east. The RPSs are all over. I think I don't know if this has changed recently. 29 states in DC, I think, is the stat. So it's the majority of U.S. states have an RPS. And these are some large renewable procurements. Then on the ZEC side, that's another huge piece. So with all of this action, trying to interact with the market, it's clear what kind of tension we're going to see with all of that. If I can pivot a bit to resilience, and obviously these are related issues. Some states are doing what they're doing with resilience in mind. It's a key priority for FERC. We did sort of in January. It's not that it's not a key priority. The January order did, however, reject the NOPA from DOE, but in the same action, it established a new docket, and I can assure you we're taking that docket very seriously. And we also know, and we're doing what we can within our jurisdiction, but we also know there's an incredible amount of action that has to be at the state level. It's not within FERC's jurisdiction, and folks have made that point to us, and it's a point very well taken. And we'll do what we can to work with those folks at the state and the regional level who ask for our help. But we're doing what we can on our side, and we recognize that there's a lot of action at the state level too. And we're still charting that path forward. And I'll preempt the questions about the timing. I'm not allowed to talk about that. But I can assure you that we're doing a lot of good work in this docket. The other thing, and this veers a little bit away from power markets, we oversee a lot of infrastructure. There's just a lot of, sort of any large infrastructure package is going to be a large percentage that's for jurisdictional. So that's the pipeline, that's the LNG, that's hydro in some cases. I think the biggest thing here is sort of what's the local impact of the FERC jurisdictional facilities, and so when we permit these things and they're allowed to be built, what's the impact? See a lot of jobs, especially on the upfront construction part, economic development. So you have areas that, say, if you're on the producing end, if you didn't have the means to move the fuel out, you wouldn't be able to produce in the first place. So see economic booms across the board. A lot of this is just gains from trade. The actions that we're taking right now, that we're reviewing the policy statement 1999, and I view that as just a normal good government practice. When a policy's 20 years old and things have changed so drastically in that industry, then it's time to take another look. The most recent thing, our general counsel gave a presentation at the September open meeting about the memorandum of understanding with PHMSA, Pipeline Hazardous Materials Safety Administration. Did I get that right? PHMSA. We just say PHMSA, that's easier. On LNG permitting, and we heard from a lot of folks that we are taking too long, and I understand. So we're taking that action to attempt to speed up. So we're trying to leverage the expertise of PHMSA and speed up the entire process. So I have to admit, I am not 100% sure that that's actually PURPA that he's signing. We were actually trying to guess. I think there's evidence in here that it's probably not PURPA, but it's a Carter era policy that, the image is meant to convey what 1978 looks like. So it's a 1978 policy, and we're going to revisit our regs. As far as the statute itself hasn't changed. We are, it was tweaked in the Energy Policy Act of 2005. The statute fundamentally has not changed. We still have the FERC mandate to do what we do. But our regs haven't changed either. We have order number 69 is from 1980. We implement PURPA in a way that has a lot of 1980 elements to it. So the short answer there is we're also reviewing PURPA. I think that was that announced? April, May or something? We're right in the middle of that. And we had, again, the record is pretty well developed. We had a tech conference back in 2016, so it's not news to us that there are issues around the PURPA regs. So we've been talking about these for a while. But again, major changes to PURPA, you would need to change the statute in a lot of cases. And we've heard that as sort of a reason for inaction is, from FERC side. We just say, we'll change the statute. And you go to Congress and they say, well, FERC should change its regs. And so I can't say what Congress is going to do, but we are addressing our regs. And I'll end on a positive note. I'll actually also note, when it comes to PURPA regs, we heard from neighbors several times about how they would like us to change our regs. It's a great example of states directly asking us for something, to review something, and we are doing that. So that's a very cooperative space. And I'll end on another very positive note. Cybersecurity, again, this is a huge threat, huge problem, but it's also one of the areas where FERC and the states are probably doing the best in terms of working cooperatively. So we have two offices, and then we this is in the FERC weeds a bit, but we have one office that's sort of backwards looking with mandatory standards, and one office that's more forward-looking in terms of, hey, we know these standards take a while, and a lot of the threats, we just can't wait years to act on the threats. So we have those two offices with those two functions, and I think that structure works really well. And with that, I'll free the podium up. We're only good questions after that.
Thank you, Travis. Yeah, I forgot to state that we'll have a panel speak and then we'll have a Q&A after that. Next up, we have Dean Foreman, who, as I stated, is the chief economist of the American Petroleum Institute, successor to our good friend John Felmy, sitting in the back row. And Dean has a PhD in economics from the University of Florida and has spent many years doing strategic planning and economic forecasting for Saudi Aramco, ExxonMobil, Talisman, and Sasol North America, which is close to my heart, being a purveyor of coal gasification. But in any event, Dean, if you could come forward and give us your remarks.
Good morning, and thanks for showing up for a 8:30 session. I realize that it's early and it can be heavy material to begin your day. For those who may not be familiar with the American Petroleum Institute, next year will be our 100th anniversary, originally established as the standard-setting organization for the industry. And today, we have some 600 plus member companies. We are by far the largest trade association that reflects all segments of the natural gas and oil industry. So it makes, when we look at things like this panel, where the changing role of government regulation, how it's affecting markets, it makes it hard when we have member companies on all sides of it. So I'm going to try to give you frank opinions, my opinions, not necessarily those of API, on different aspects of it. And also speak to my role at API is really to kind of take stock of what's happening now and to communicate that, hopefully in pretty broad and plain terms. So the things that we can really, I think, weigh in on right now, what's remarkable and what's been evolving through the course of this year is month after month this year, we've had new U.S. records in terms of exports and production. It's natural gas, it's oil, it's natural gas liquids. And it's actually quite astounding, even to those of us in the industry, how strong the productivity has been and how this has been innovation really unlocking both technical innovation and process innovation that's been unlocking productivity that has driven prices down. Now, for all the fuss and every headline you see on oil markets, we're talking about 2% global growth in oil markets. All of it for 2%. But quietly, here in the US, we've had 12% growth in US natural gas. And again, this is unlocking a lot of production. It was partly the planning of now US LNG exports that have grown a lot this last year. But that's what's possible. We've seen growth in US gas markets of 9 to 10 million cubic feet per day, or 12%. So starting with that, now we have to say, what do we do with all this gas if that's what's possible? And I'll take you through some of the story on that. On the export side, it's not just natural gas and oil. It's natural gas liquids, it's ethane, it's petrochemicals. There are a lot of things that we're now exporting. And especially on the gas side and the oil side, it's important to take note that before these were approved, before we had the approval to make the exports, there was quite a battle over dueling economists saying, well, this is going to raise domestic prices or it's not. And frankly, I think we're seeing pretty definitive evidence at this point that these exports have been begetting their own incremental new sources of supply. And as that's happening, this is economic growth and jobs and activity, and frankly, increases in productivity that have been a nice virtuous circle that's been benefiting the U.S. as a whole. Now, let's talk about the headwinds. Trade policies as they've been evolving, especially from the administration, the trade spat with China. There are a few different flavors. We've got the negotiations of the North American Free Trade Agreement and where that's going. And then On top of this, monetary policy reinforcing a really strong dollar. All of these are making it really challenging for exports, not just in our industry, but broadly for a lot of manufacturers. So if we're going to sustain this energy renaissance, the thing I want you to take away from today, besides the details that I'll give you in a moment, is that it's a growth concept. And if we're going to keep this going, and if you're going to incentivize companies at $10 billion a pop to build new ethane cracker derivatives complexes, new LNG export facilities, they have to have good experience on the way in. And the first wave of it has gotten some traction, but these headwinds are potentially really costly. We need to see where it goes. So, just broad spectrum, the things that we all think about where energy policy interacts with the world of energy. We all think first of transportation fuels. It's what we see every day in terms of the price of the pump. The long-term policy issues of whether we subsidize certain things, we put CAFE standards, as Peter mentioned earlier, the electrification potentially of the grid in the long run. Policy plays an important role in the evolution of our transportation systems. On the heating and cooling side, residential, commercial, space heating, building efficiency standards, government plays a role there. As you just heard from FERC, the power sector, and a lot of this, I'll go into in a second, but it's been a fuel transition. It's been inter-fuel competition against one another that's had some environmental benefits that have been really important. And there's also a technology element to that, and there's a political economy element to that in terms of how it's evolving. And then there's the piece that everybody forgets about or takes for granted. And that's if you're wearing eyeglasses, if you have contacts, if you go camping and you like materials that are strong and light in weight, but yet pliable, materials and material science. Every cell phone that we have, half of it in one way, shape, or form is oil and natural gas. So this is something, and it's the question I actually get asked when I present externally to a lot of audiences. When you have an energy outlook that goes out the long run, why don't you have more efficiency in the industrial sector? Well, you don't, because it's not burnable carbon. It's stuff that is fundamental to the things that we as Americans, but frankly consumers globally want and need. So we can't forget about that, and that's going to be part of the energy mix on an enduring basis. So let's look at the long run outlook for the US. This is the EIA's view. Total energy consumption, so on the top line, chart, quadrillion BTUs on the left axis. This is all forms of energy. And then we've got energy-related CO2 emissions with the blue line. And what you see is they pretty much move in lockstep until about 2005. And then as, frankly, the energy renaissance really takes off, and you start getting natural gas growth, especially out of the Barnett to start, and then go into other shale plays throughout America. Natural gas pushing into the power sector has brought emissions down substantially. US emissions of CO2, energy-related ones, are at 25-year lows. In the power sector, they're at 30-year lows. And there's no other source of that. It's been substantially natural gas supplanting coal in the power sector. Now, what's interesting about the EIA's view going forward is you see the lines kind of go parallel all the way out to 2040. So a year ago, we had a clean power plan. Now we don't. We have a replacement, America's Clean Energy Plan. Without advocating for one over the other, the implication of it, though, was coal was decreasing 3% per year in the former one. And now, if you think about the nature of long-run energy outlooks, you normally look for incremental changes from year to year, things that aren't like tectonic and shifting. But this is a really big shift. And the implication of it means that the biggest source of emissions reductions that we've had in the United States over the last 10 years, 13 years, doesn't produce really any going all the way up to 2040. The only emissions reductions in the EIA's view by 2040 stem from the transportation sector and the assumption around improving vehicle efficiency. So let's talk briefly about the power sector. I'm going to shift back to natural gas after this. But the root of gas or inter-fuel competition in the power sector is how competitive natural gas is vis-a-vis renewables, coal, nuclear, those are your main sources there. And what is an evolution, and this is the EIA's levelized cost of energy projections for year 2022, so this is an overnight cost, taking all the capital, all the maintenance, all the operations, and discounting it to today, and then stacking it up across the different technologies to make a comparison. And basically what it says is even without the investment tax credit, wind and solar in many areas are neck and neck competitive with natural gas. This didn't used to be the case, but it's why they have a 2-to-1 capacity added between wind and solar versus natural gas. So natural gas is still getting additions into the power sector, but renewables are making substantive progress. It does beg the question whether you need subsidies after a certain point for these things, and the affordability of those will become a question. But at this point, this is good news in terms of pushing more renewables in, and gas tends to be complementary with that, because unless and until you have cost-effective battery storage, and battery storage is still an order of magnitude higher in cost than natural gas. Natural gas is your best way to ramp the grid up and down to improve that reliability and that resilience as you have a greater penetration of renewables into the grid. So I'm going to shift to natural gas markets and talk about what we do with all this gas. As Travis was mentioning, one of FERC's roles is approving LNG projects. And if you compare the landed gas prices around the world, here we have sub $3 per million BTU gas prices in North America. And we have for now 4 consecutive years. Around the world, these numbers have ranged. It's been pretty low in recent years. It's been 6, 7, 8. Now, very recently, as of July, we're up toward 10 in Japan and developing Asia, and the 8s and 9s in the European realm. These prices are enough if it provides an incentive for gas to flow if you have an existing project. The problem is if you don't, and you need to underpin new projects, say out of North America, people have to expect the prices will remain high. And these numbers usually have to start with 10, 11, and 12 before it's enough to underpin a new project. Now we have to also overlay, though, the fact that China's put 10% tariffs on US natural gas exports. And let's face it, especially in Asia Pacific, security of supply is one of the important ingredients is to gain trust to sign a long-term procurement agreement for LNG. And if you're having a trade spat with that partner, it's really hard to get them to come to the table and sign a trustful long-term agreement. Now, what's changed in the US? What's enabled this gas price to remain $3 per million BTU? This is actually a little bit surprising and not common knowledge. For years, we've been talking about natural gas production in lockstep with oil. The fact that you get an uplift from the liquids value of natural gas liquids. Well, the top slice of this left-hand chart, which is showing US gas production by play type, there is associated gas from liquids plays, especially in the Permian Basin, and it has been growing. But 60% of the growth in gas is a resurgence in dedicated gas drilling this last year. This is Ohio and Pennsylvania, parts of Texas, Louisiana. So the Haynesville in Louisiana and Texas, and then Marcellus and Utica formations in Appalachia, so Ohio and Pennsylvania, New York not producing. What's changed when we look at the break-even cost, this is from BTU Analytics on the right-hand side, is that over the last several years, things that were thought impossible when we were talking about break-evens of I need gas prices for a dedicated gas well. If I'm going to drill that, I used to need $3.50 to $4 per million BTU. Now it's sub $2 in each of these areas, below $2 per million BTU. This was impossible. And it's only, again, continued innovation, continued process improvements that, again, were thought impossible. So now, translate this into the EIA's latest outlook. The blue regions show, first for price expectations and then for production on the right, their latest annual energy outlook from 2018. The dotted lines compare their outlook 1 year ago, and then the green line is a sensitivity case for the high oil and gas resource and technology case from the 2018 version. Well, the first thing to take away is that now the dotted line in prices versus the production amount, not production amount, prices versus prices from 2017 to 18, that's not a marginal shift. To come down from $5 per million BTU toward 4 is a really large shift. And it's indicative of what we as an industry have been saying for several years, which is we believe we're actually in this high oil and gas resource and technology case. We're tracking it. We continue each year to see the resource base for natural gas get upgraded. If we look at 2016 estimates of resource for technically recoverable relative to production, we're up to 150 years worth of natural gas in North America. This is phenomenal. And that means if you take the EIA's modeling of this, and it's not a forecast, it's a sensitivity, they would say $3 per million BTU like we've had the last 4 years for as far as the eye can see for the next 22. Now, if you believe that, their model would say that means the production amounts, and hence the market taking it, should push us up toward 150 billion cubic feet per day by 2040. So that's a lot of gas. Now let's look at where that might go. The bottom 3 pieces on this for the reference case from EIA and for the high oil and gas resource and technology case show all of domestic demand for gas for the United States. And that's just quantified so you can see the changes on the right-hand side. So let's go back to the introduction where I was telling you that 9 to 10 billion cubic feet per day is what the upstream potential is for 1 year of growth, 9 to 10 billion cubic feet per day. So call that a year. What this says is in the reference case, I can add up everything on the domestic side and I only get 1 year of growth over the next 22. 1 year. So gas is stuffed from an upstream perspective if we're looking at the long run outlook. That's a really important message to understand because of both the economic and the environmental benefits that that gas has produced over the last 13 years. If we take the high case, we only get up to 26 or 7, so call that 2.5 years worth of growth, like the last year. So what else are we going to do with this gas? Well, let's look at the export side for LNG. Well, that says we could get another 2 to 3 years worth of growth. So we're talking just a handful of years worth of growth for gas markets like the last one out the next 22. So was this last one an anomaly or is it enduring and it really kind of pushes the sensitivities of what you might expect in these cases? So this next chart is a seriatim of all the stacks of LNG projects across North America. Some that are locked in, shown in blue on the bottom, they're either operational or highly likely. Ones that in Bloomberg New Energy Finance's view were coded as likely, that are in a darker green, and then a bunch of others, a lot of others. And by the way, the coding of likely versus unlikely is almost meaningless here. The fact is you've got a lot of projects, and tomorrow, if they come with the right infrastructure, if they bring a buyer in the market that's willing to sign that contract, the one that might seem least likely or the most unlikely could become the most credible tomorrow and move to the bottom of the stack. The important thing is to take also note of 40 billion cubic feet per day worth of these projects. So from an API perspective, API would say, approve them all and let the market sort out which ones will actually move forward. The reality is not all of these have the enabling infrastructure or partners and capital that can make it happen. And it's going to take a market to figure out which ones should go. But from the beginning of the LNG section, when I showed you those prices globally, this is a global supply-demand issue. We've had projects in Australia, the US, and other places that have been coming for the last 5 years, many of which are over time and budget. And frankly, that's led to a lot of LNG in the last few years, especially as many of the prices are tied to oil and that's going down. So when it's a global supply-demand issue, there's not much on the policy side that can force that to change. And if you can't, from a policy perspective, move the needle on LNG, it pushes you back to now that domestic demand slice, which we're looking at 1 to 2.5 years worth of growth. But now comes the direction from the administration to the Department of Energy to subsidize coal and nuclear plants that otherwise might retire. Well, the high nuclear case from EIA, just nuclear, not coal, would detract 8 to 9 billion cubic feet per day by 2019 and 20. So detract 1 year of growth. If you add coal to that, it's that again and worse. Plus it costs consumers another 20 billion a year to fund those subsidies. So look, there may be a grand vision out of all of this, and as an industry, we're just questioning the rationale, trying to say, look, from the trade and market growth perspective and how it ties back to the economies, especially it has a state flavor for the states that are producing this gas. It's really important. Now, from a gas market perspective, the destination-specific data are only available through May. But just to give you a size for our gas exports had expanded from 0.8 for less than 1 billion cubic feet per day are now projected as of September to be up to 2.8. This is LNG, the vast majority of the growth going to Asia. So if we're pressing China really hard, and frankly, our trading partners in Asia, that has been our biggest growth market for natural gas. And quietly at the bottom, notice Mexico at 4.9 billion cubic feet per day. So what are we doing with NAFTA? This is, for many companies in our industry, an important infrastructure, a once-in-a-generation opportunity where there's been an opening across the entire energy complex to partner with Mexico's economy. And frankly, it's our biggest gas market. It's the most important one in terms of our exports. It's mainly pipe, but it's important. And the growth that we're seeing in terms of Marcellus and Utica in particular, it's backing out Canadian imports. So it's becoming more zero-sum in terms of the amount that we're, as North America, then producing. So these are important dynamics, and it's a shift from the way it has been traditionally. The last thing I want to hit on the trade side is, just this last Thursday, we put out what's called a monthly statistical report. John used to write it, and I've assumed the mantle of doing this. We have a statistics department that every week surveys 85% of the industry. And you may be familiar that we in EIA each week put out an inventory report that tends to move the market in terms of oil prices. But there's a lot more in those surveys besides just inventories. There's supply, demand, stocks, trade, oil, natural gas liquids, but all the products, all the refined products in detail. And we package it together kind of concisely, and these resources in our quarterly outlook are available on API's website under the Chief Economist section. But the headline this last week is a drop in exports of 1.3 million barrels per day of crude and refined products in 2 months. So let me put this in plain language in terms of what it means for our net petroleum trade balance, because it's really important. As of June, we were a net importer of only 2.9 million barrels per day. It's been, in May, it was actually a little lower than that, but that's about as close as we've gotten to true energy independence where we're not a net importer, right? In 2 months, we're back up to 4.5 million barrels per day, a 56% increase in 2 months. A lot of this, and we don't have the destination-specific data, again, it's going to be a few months before that's available, but what it appears to be is a pretty marked sign from China sending us a message, shifting its buying patterns, at the same time as we've kind of naively reimposed sanctions on Iran and made Iran's barrels very cheap and fungible. So here's the alternative, you can take them cheaply. What you would expect in the US to respond to that is that it destroys value, and the US has to find another buyer and try to drop the price to find that buyer. And in fact, that's kind of what we're seeing so far this month. If you look at a blowout between international prices and domestic prices, the international prices haven't changed much. The domestic prices for West Texas Intermediate have been dropping like crazy. So watch this space. These are important issues. They're really important all the way back to jobs, the economy, everything from a US perspective. These are new sources of growth, production growth, that are not otherwise needed or frankly cannot be utilized in a saturated market here domestically. So if we're going to grow in this realm, we need enabling trade policies to go with it, and a cogent energy policy that sees how all pieces fit together. That concludes my comments, and I welcome questions. Thank you.
Okay. Now I'd like to introduce the Assistant Secretary for Land and Minerals Management of the Department of the Interior, Mr. Joe Balash, who will speak to us about policy from the DOI.
Good morning. I don't have any slides, so I'm just going to have to captivate you with the wizardry of my words. I will not hold it against you if you're not off a little bit. It's early. Thank you, Peter, for the introduction. Thank you to the organization here for the invitation, an opportunity to speak about some of the things we're doing from a policy perspective at the Department of the Interior. The job that I have, Assistant Secretary for Land and Minerals Management, gives me day-to-day reporting and briefing responsibilities with the Bureau of Land Management, our 2 offshore bureaus, Bowman Bessie, as well as the Office of Surface Mining and Regulatory Enforcement. What that means essentially is that our energy-related agencies within the Department of the Interior all come up through my office and on to the Deputy Secretary and Secretary. Now, I'm not a lawyer and I'm not an economist, so some might wonder why I have this job. And the reality is I've had a tremendous opportunity and good fortune having grown up in the state of Alaska and spent the better part of my career working in state government, where there is a tremendous land endowment. The last job I had there was as the commissioner for the Department of Natural Resources, where we oversaw more than 100 million acres of uplands, another 50 million acres offshore and submerged lands, producing 500,000 barrels of oil per day. We had everything from mining, timber, ag, parks, you name it, but energy is a big part of the Alaska economy, and managing the inherent conflicts between energy development and a pristine environment is something that I basically cut my teeth on, and when you look at the portfolio that this job is responsible for, I think it was a very good training ground in that regard. Specifically with regard to the nature of economics, as I said, I am not myself an economist, but I've had the good fortune of working with very many over the years, and I haven't seen her come in today, but Marianne Ka is somebody who I've crossed paths with up in Alaska when she was with Conoco previously. So before I get into some of the energy policy and regulation points of my talk, I just want to mention some real basic data about energy here in the U.S. and then sort of how DOI fits into that. None of this is going to be earth-shattering to you, but it's just part of putting things into context about here's what energy means to the country, here's DOI's work in that. The oil and natural gas industry supports 9.8 million jobs. The electric and power industry alone support more than 7 million jobs, or 1 in 20 of those in America. The GDP, oil and gas industry contributes 8% of the total GDP. Electric power industry alone makes up 5%, at more than $1 trillion. Total energy expenditures, average household spends 6.7% of its income on energy every year. And beyond the direct contributions to the economy, energy also deeply linked to other sectors in ways that aren't always obvious. For example, each calorie of food that we consume requires an average input of 5 calories of fossil fuels. And for high-end products like beef, this rises to 80 calories. The energy sector is also the biggest industrial user of fresh water, kind of a big deal to people who live out in the West, accounting for 40% of all freshwater withdrawals in the U.S. Total investment in the energy sector was $276 billion in 2016, second largest in the world. China's number one. Growth of the U.S. economy, the correlation between growth rates in real GDP and electricity use is as high as 89%. So that's a good indicator of where we're experiencing opportunity. Domestic energy production represents about 90% of our consumption, and the difference, that 10%, is largely due to the net on crude oil export-imports. The three major fossil fuels, petroleum, natural gas, and coal, again, those are the ones that primarily come up through my office, combined altogether account for 77.6% of the U.S. primary energy production in 2017. So the Department of the Interior, the land manager for the United States government, we are in many ways at the forefront of the Trump administration's goals to rebalance our economy, regulation, and use of our resources. We're the steward and manager of America's natural resources. We have an incredible endowment of oil, gas, coal, hydropower, and renewable energy opportunities. The department is the steward of 20% of the nation's lands. It includes 700 million acres of subsurface mineral estate onshore and 2.3 billion acres offshore. We manage resources providing approximately 19% of the nation's energy supply and 17% of the nation's hydropower supply. Offshore, natural gas coming from offshore has gotten to be a smaller and smaller piece of the prize out there, down to about 4%. But our share of the oil production is still at a heavy and healthy 19%, something that we want to maintain in the years ahead. And I see my bone folks back there. Good job. In addition to helping provide all of that energy, we help generate $10 billion in annual revenue. That's one of the federal government's largest sources of non-tax income. And so I like to just point out that we're doing something positive to create revenue for the government as opposed to a taxing event. So now, those energy actions have a multiplier out there in the economy. It's not just a matter of the very direct effect on the economy in terms of these energy projects. We've been, for a lot of different reasons, taking a hard look at the shallow water elements of the Gulf of Mexico. And there, what we see in terms of an impact is that for every $1 million that's invested, we see a return or an impact in the local economy, particularly if you consider the reinvestment of local tax dollars of $1.7 to $2 million. So it is an important fiber string in the fabric of our economy, of our communities, especially in the rural parts of America. And so as I turn to the policy side of things, the policy of this administration is guided by a number of different documents. And I think in this particular space, the president, before winning his seat in the White House, was as articulate on policy in this space as he was on anything in terms of laying out a coherent objective that serves us even today. But since coming into office, he's issued a number of executive orders, 13795, that, to quote, is to promote clean and safe development of our nation's vast energy resources, while at the same time avoiding regulatory burdens that unnecessarily encumber energy production, constrain economic growth, and prevent job creation. So he's, since articulating that energy policy through an EO in different speeches, evolved his articulation of this from a goal of energy independence to one of energy dominance, something that we at the Department of the Interior support in whole. Over the past year or so, the Secretary of the Interior, Ryan Zinke, has followed on with his own orders at the departmental level to ensure that the department is following the course set by the President, that we are achieving the direction that has been laid out. And while we're making great strides in transforming the President's vision into actual policy on the ground, there's still an awful lot left to do. As we make these strides, as we make this progress, we're using our resources and technology to not only reduce our dependence on imported oil and petroleum products, but also on natural gas. The shale revolution fundamentally changed the natural gas markets in this country. And if we get our policy right here domestically, we can impact the wider world. Just 10 years ago, in 2008, we had 8 active import facilities, another 28 that had been approved from a regulatory standpoint and awaiting funding to construct. That is just bizarre in what we know about natural gas markets today. Those facilities, those 8 facilities have been turned around. We're now into the greenfield phase of LNG export facility design, construction, and financing. And we have some incredible opportunities to move even further afield in that regard. And the big question from a policy perspective is, well, gosh, if we export these commodities outside of our country, what's going to happen to our domestic markets? Is there going to be an increase in price for our consumers, and isn't that bad? Well, the Department of Energy is charged with examining these questions and has been taking some incremental steps over this past decade to examine that question. And just earlier this summer, the department issued a report from NERA examining this question, and it showed that in an unconstrained environment for exports, that there's very little impact on the prices that our consumers will pay here outside of some regional spots where it's more of an infrastructure issue than it is a supply issue, and that in the broader context, that the benefit to the economy in broad terms, and particularly consumer benefits, is a positive one. And so the big constraint in their examination here in that model is access to the resource and technology. And the way I read that is, they're trying to be a little soft in the warning here, but as long as we don't lock up land and stop fracking, we're going to be in great shape. So that's my read on their study. But more broadly, as Dean showed, America is now a net exporter of natural gas, and really there's no real limit to the potential there. As of July this year, FERC has approved 9 LNG export terminals. There's another 15 in the queue waiting. 4 new export terminals are under construction. Their completion will enable the export of more than 11 billion cubic feet per day to our friends and allies around the world. And while DOI is not directly responsible for the terminals, the policies that we promote in terms of making acreage available and reviewing and approving right-of-ways for pipelines is critical to moving that gas to those facilities and getting to market ultimately. So to continue this trend that Dean pointed at in terms of moving our production to a point that we are in fact independent, the department's making efforts to streamline the permitting process, increase regulatory certainty, and also maintain a safe and responsible development footprint in these places. So the policy benefits, as I mentioned before, accrue to the Treasury and the broader economy in general. But $10 billion is nothing to slouch at. And we saw just a couple of weeks ago some rather shocking numbers that came out of a lease sale in the Permian Basin down in the Carlsbad region of New Mexico. We were optimistic. We were ready to pop some champagne over a couple $100 million. And to get as close as we did to $1 billion was very surprising to us, but I think a very positive indicator of what is out there in terms of an expectation for the long term. And I will acknowledge what Dean pointed out. There are some headwinds, there are some issues associated with trade right now that we view as a negotiation. Our expectation is that we will overcome these current additional costs in the marketplace because of the tariff fight that's going on between our nation and China in particular. We view that as temporary. I'm sure that's very little solace to people having to pay fees, but that is where we see things. And so the key to that is, in our view, unleashing the might of America's natural resource potential on public lands. And that's where the Secretary's orders and policy directions really come into play. There are things that we've done to basically remove barriers, obstacles that had been erected previously in access to land. Secretary Zinke, on his first day in office, eliminated the coal moratorium from the DOI register, eliminated the unclear mineral valuation processes, and is taking on redundant and costly regulations. Now, one of the key things that I try to convey to people is it's not enough for us as a department to simply make more land available and have regular lease sales, open up frontier areas like